What's next for IT? In today's economy, technology touches every aspect of the day-to-day operations of business. There has never been more pressure on IT to deliver for our organizations. So what can we expect over the next decade? We need to think differently about how we approach our work to continue to thrive into the future. This requires all of us to be intentional in how we look at our role going forward. Smart IT is an approach to getting the important things done by transforming the way we think, work, and lead. And now, let's disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk the Smart IT way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Smart IT Podcast. Today, I'm proud and pleasure to welcome Daniel Waters to the show. Today, we're going to talk about cybersecurity, strategy, what it's like for IT professionals on the front line of defending our organizations from multiple attackers out there. And I want to bring Dan on because he has a great experience helping clients deal with cyber defense, building their strategy, helping to talk to the business side of the house, and helping us defend our way of life. Welcome to the show today, Dan.
Thank you, William. It's great to be here. Love the podcast. Love what you're doing. You and I have a little bit of a relationship anyway, so I think this is going to go great. I'm very keen to be able to share some of my experiences and what the review looking of the world looks like, and a little bit of the forward view as far as cybersecurity technology and what we can expect there, what's to come.
So Dan, so I'm glad to have you on here because, as you know, the Smart IT Podcast is looking forward, helping IT professionals, everything from the CIO, CTO, digital officers, down to the people on the front line, to architecting, building, operating very advanced infrastructure to support the needs of businesses across the board. And as we keeping the lights on and helping the businesses innovate, we have this thing on the background, right? Or not sitting on the background, it's in the foreground now. So as executives and board members and C-suites turn on the local news and the national news, and they're hearing a lot of noise about disruptions to businesses, operational disruptions, cyber breaches. We're talking about FBI and CISA, a lot of three-letter acronyms. We're talking about nation states and criminal organizations, a lot of things that have absolutely nothing to do with their business. So let's take a step back here and just talk about cyber at a kind of a larger picture. And as you started your career and as you look at like we're thinking about today in the news, just give me like kind of a overview, kind of what you feel like when the business person turns the news on and they're talking about a business that's down and disrupted.
Sure. And this is something where I think it's important to have a long-term view, a long-term perspective of where did this start out? What has generated the movement forward into where we are today, recent times, looking forward as well? Because essentially you're right. We've got this state where we are in perpetuity, interconnected, whether we're at work or not at work. We've got this certain pace of IT, pace of news. And so this technology innovation has really driven this pace, which has then cascaded over into a certain pace of the business operating environment, whether that be internal within your organization or across the, let's call it extra organizational ecosphere. And as far as what executives and boards need to be thinking about, part of the issue here, and I think this is very important, is there's a certain priority saturation. In the end of the day, companies are not led by robots. They're led by people. And people have families, they have friends, they have their careers, and they're trying to do the best that they can. So where do you focus, right? You've got only so much resources available to you, resources being time, resources being financial, resources being talent, and probably a few other resources as well, but I think they're kind of the main ones. So if you are operating a security program to safeguard, protect, and risk mitigate in your organization, I think it's important to realize that you do not have finite resources. And if you did have that you have finite resources, that you don't have infinite resources. And even if you had all the money in the world, there would still be some kind of risk there. So what's that balance? And so I think what folks are really looking to understand is, whether they're aware of it or not, is what is that balance? How can I be more effective, more efficient, given the pace of the news, the pace of events? The other thing kind of overshadowing some of what you allude to there is, if you think about the state of cyber going back 15 years ago, right, or 20 years ago, sure, we had internet, but really the internet-oriented ecosphere was burgeoning. We also had a less complex technology surface in our organization. So virtualization was something that was starting to emerge. There was no such thing, at least I don't think there was so much such a thing as containers back in those days. So, and definitely not cloud, right? So the complexity of what we have to deal with has presented opportunity to the adversary, opportunity being speed to attack organizations of, as you will know, through robots, and most of it is through robots now, software robots. And we're essentially in a state of war in perpetuity. And as you know, part of balancing yourself, balancing your teams, and being able to operate a business effectively and efficiently is that you're able to cycle up, cycle down, have clear perspective, right? So this is where I think the role of strategy is very important, to be able to understand what the risks are, what the technological and security related impacts are, and then coalesce that, align that with our business. And I think the closer cooperation we have with the business from a strategic standpoint, the more that we can be on a more front footing, and that we're able to manage our teams, retain the talent that we care about, maintain good relationships, and ultimately secure our organizations. So that fatigue of that ongoing war mentality never goes away. We solve 5 risks. There's 5 more coming over the fence. It's very exhausting. And as you'll know, coming across this pandemic era and post-pandemic era, this really kicked things up a gear. So a lot of what I hear from clients and organizations is, hey, we're really battle weary. What can we do? So we start to go into a bit of a realm where this used to be about how well I can maintain my firewall, how I can harden my accounts and harden my vulnerability surface. For example, now we have to start thinking about that people element. How do I safeguard my people, balance their time, balance their state of mind? Because at the end of the day, there are processes in organizations, but at the end of the day, people are the ones that are largely executing, making the key decisions, and are the material lever, if you will, to manage and reduce risk.
So this is interesting, Dan, and we started to think about things in like the real world, like USSR versus the West and the US, right? We're talking about a Cold War, where it's like we're going to settle in for a long period of time, and we're talking decades, right? So at some point, you have to go back to home to your families, got to get in some type of regular cadence. So I like the fact that we're talking about burnout really here, right? So if we don't think about it correctly, we'll have professions who are burning out very quickly. You know, average tenure of a CISO might be less than 2 years. We got people in the SOC who may be burning out in 6 months, 9 months. So let's talk about, I guess we talked about strategy before, but a strategy of leading a team. We're setting the tone properly to think about this Cold War or this long enduring conflict where every single day we're trying to deal with somebody who's trying to disrupt our business. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's important, as you talked about before, having strategy here. So I think it's a great opportunity for leaders in IT and cyber teams to really set the tone for their teams, that, you know, we can ease into this because we're settling in for a very long journey here. So let's talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. And I love the Cold War reference. You probably don't know, I actually wanted to be a history teacher before I went down the path that I'm on. So I'm a little bit of a Cold War buff, Napoleonic eras buff. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from military strategy and political strategy that can transpose into what we're doing. It might not be the whole thing, but there might be key learnings, right? And And I think one of the key learnings is, and I'll use the reference of Hannibal in the Punic Wars. Hannibal, they say he knew how to win the battle, but not how to extract the leverage into essentially a war advantage. So that was some kind of historical comment around Hannibal. By the way, strong guy. He walked elephants over the mountains, right? So if you didn't know that, I mean, there's a lot to understand there as far as human level fortitude. But as far as, I guess something that I've learned a bit from when I had my business, just to kind of digress slightly. So I actually worked with some very, very clever people who are very smart on the occupational health and safety front. And so they really educated me on a number of things that, if you're in the OSHA industry, this is something that, and for people who are outside the United States, occupational health and safety, so OHS is another acronym, but in the US, call it OSHA. What they kind of told me or taught me is a lot about the brain chemistry and the science and the psychology about this. So apparently, not known to me prior and probably not known to too many people, the average human makes X amount of mistakes per hour, for example, 3. And the more intense the pressure, there's frameworks around it, but essentially the more intense the pressure, the more pressure you're under, the more you're out of, let's call it this nice zone of performance, you start to make more mistakes. Now, the other part to that, to kind of link some psychology here, something that I really focused on with a Big Four organization that I was working with when I was having time management issues, is when you're under time pressure, some funny things actually start to happen. So we're starting to talk about the front of the brain and the rear of the brain. So to make it simple, the rear of the brain is where all the automated behaviors exist. So to use the rear of the brain, it uses a low amount of energy, right, without going too deep into the brain chemistry side of things. So if you give me an equation, right, I'm going to use the front of my brain and say, okay, I calculated that out, or you gave me a problem to solve. It's continual, the front part of the brain that has to calculate, has to think, that has to reason and create logic. And as the brain becomes under pressure, or the human condition becomes under pressure, you start to make more and more shortcuts to preserve the amount of energy that's available to the brain, and it gets shuffled or accelerated to the rear. So that's where you see when people are under pressure, time pressure, etc., and this pandemic phenomenon and post-pandemic phenomenon is a good kind of data point around this. You start to automate bad habits. So you increase the amount of bad habits that you have. Now, what that means from our security teams, well, you don't have to compute the math on that too much, right? You can understand, well, people can kind of start making decisions that they maybe shouldn't be making in a somewhat autopilot fashion, right? And as you know, a lot of what we deal with in security, it's a lot of data, a lot of information. Sometimes you've got to make judgment calls, and it's very difficult to keep up the pace for the reasons we talked about prior. So as far as what the solution is to this, I don't know that anyone necessarily has one, but I think an awareness is a really strong point. And something I think also gets missed a little bit is, at the end of the day, let's call it the good old-fashioned days, there was much more of a team environment, right? It was less solo duty, whereas now I think there's a lot of solo duty, a lot of isolationist type roles. And I think a team harmony, team synergy, knowing someone's beside you, they've got your back, etc., really helps perform in a team environment. Because at the end of the day, security program or IT program is a large team environment. It's teams of teams, etc. Yeah. So one of the things you also hear about is we've got a loss of cohesion. We've got operational friction. So you can start to see how this human layer, which I affectionately call OSI layer 8, right? Little inside joke.
Yes.
That it starts to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It starts to impact, right, the security program. So factoring in this human condition, culture, balance, whatever this translates to, unique to what problems you're trying to solve, the individual teams, the individual within the team, etc., I think it's very important to have a specific approach to how you manage your teams, right? So a lot of information there, but again, just linking some of the kind of information you typically wouldn't see associated with security apparatus, security programs. And as a former software engineer who would have thought that this stuff was absolutely ridiculous earlier in my career, it's taken me a while to learn some tough learnings, if you will, over time.
Well, it goes back, I guess, once again to cyber strategy, right? So we want to have a structured approach to how we're going to build up our teams, the people part. We want to have very well-established process, how we onboard users, how we manage the life cycle of users, how do we manage and onboard devices, applications, how do we monitor this infrastructure, how do we look for threats. So that process needs to be very well-organized, well thought out, and matured over a period of time based off of how much investment the business is bringing to your team. And of course, the technology. So there's a lot of different components and pieces there. Now, obviously, earlier in our security program days and early days of CISOs, there were a lot of ad hoc programs, right? There was like a framework maybe a CISO may have latched onto. Maybe we kind of do something like a control-based framework. But now we have a lot more frameworks, controls, ontologies, a lot more tooling, ways to automate. So like to put all these different pieces together, it can be very overwhelming for a lot of new CISOs, right? So let's talk about, approaching it in a structured manner where we can maintain pace. We can keep up with the demands of the business, keep up with the new adversaries as they're changing, but do so at a pace that's humane to the workers, right? So it's kind of funny. You look at an operational board and it's looking at 99% utilization on CPU and people like freak out like, oh my God, this is a problem. We need to call it expand capacity. But when we see our counterparts, our colleagues, the actual humans stressed out, it's like a whole different animal. It's like we're treating humans less than machines, right? 90% utilization for a computer, bad. Human, well, maybe just take a couple of days off and come back. So that balance seems to be, if we don't build out and design for it, it's like the humans are going to be left at the bottom of the barrel. So when you look at CISOs and other security leaders looking at their security program, when you advise them, you're doing your day-to-day job, you're talking to them. And then when you don't hear the word strategy in there, what pops in your mind and say, you know what, let's stop, let's step back. Why are you buying this tool? Who's going to run it? Can you actually keep up with pace? So let's talk about that importance of, once again, making sure we have a solid strategy in place.
Yeah. And I think something that's not necessarily completely unique to security, but given in security, what we're kind of doing is all day, every day, we're solving problems. We solve one, move it on the next one. And really, for me, a quality security practitioner, irrespective of level or a career progression, is someone that asks the right questions. If you're going to solve any problem in the world, whether it be what we're talking about here, or maybe you're building a bridge or whatever, engineer, building a car, you must ask the right questions. And I think this is something that maybe has lost a little bit of attention or focus over the years, probably because I would say we've become a little bit dependent on technology, probably a lot dependent on technology. But at the end of the day, that technology is essentially there or resultant from the fact that someone asked the right questions at the right point in time, or maybe the wrong point in time. But the art of asking the right question is very, very important, because you will not identify the right problem if you don't ask the right questions. And sometimes you've got to liaise and orchestrate with the right people. And another component, and I'll get more into the meat of your question here, is kind of a little bit to there. It's important to be a good listener. And security folks, they like to talk, at least a lot of them, right? And not too much listening. But listening for me is, I guess, on a personal front, something that, let's say I've developed over time. I would attribute that skill development or that habit to probably be the greatest influencer on my career. And so that's very important, right? But if we skip over to a strategic discussion, where does strategy fit in? ultimately, how does it help? It helps because, again, we're dealing with very complex problems and we want to rationalize those resources available to us relative to the output, relative to the outcomes. And hopefully, if we get it right, we can have an enjoyable workplace where we're performing well, where people turn up, they're happy to be there, right? Where teams are happy. And I think this is very important in an age where talent retention is somewhat challenging. Folks are looking for compensation, but they're also looking for more meaning out of their lives. And as you get older and obviously you have family and so on and so forth, this stuff starts to become a little bit more important to you, right? Because you don't want to be working 90 hours a week anymore like you did earlier in your career. It probably won't go down too well on the home front. So strategy, apart from everything we talked about, where are our risks? Where are our threats? What should we be doing with our SOC? What's our relationship with IT? What business problems do we need to manage? Where is the business going? Where we'll be in 3 years, etc. Again, harnessing that people layer. So you're able to drive scale. And that's another word that doesn't get used enough, scale. Without scale, what are you doing? You are driving tribal knowledge. You are driving backup between very specific people who are very important, but you're not scaling what they know across your teams. So that scale is very, very important. And the scale also allows you to keep up with that pace of IT, that pace of security, pace of, let's call it business stretch, if you will. And that's very important because you've seen time to time again, you've got an Albert Einstein over here who was used to fixing every problem in the organization. What happens when they leave? You can't even replace them with 4 or 5 people. They're literally irreplaceable. So again, from a strategy perspective, that's important. The other 2 issues I would highlight, apart from kind of listening and asking the right questions when we're talking about strategic discussions or formulating a strategy, I would say the ability to focus on fundamentals and execute those fundamentals well. Now, organizations, they're kind of, to give you a taste of the landscape, which I know you're familiar with, they are getting pulled in every direction by a certain publication, from a news article, from something that was in a research group, for example. You should do this because it's the next trendy thing to do. So their emotions just get shut down because they're dragged in every direction at once. But let's focus on the fundamentals relative to what we're supposed to be doing to support our business. So there are key areas, in my view, which are always part of core security fundamentals, which is vulnerability management, configuration management. I would tie asset management to that, right? Although asset management is a bit of a floating capability. All things identity privilege. If you think about computer science 101, the ability to manage good hygiene around your accounts, abiding with the principle of least privilege, right? And then cascade that across complex environments. Very important. As you know, you shadow IT, you've got these skunkworks projects, and usually they kind of present some kind of ripe opportunity for some kind of cyber reconnaissance, right? So they are, I think, really kind of the main pieces there, as well as, if we consider cloud has kind of turned a lot of things on its head. The control surface looks very different compared to what's been traditional on premises, even if the same ones and zeros are kind of in play, lift and shift, if you will. So ultimately, we're going back to that theme of complexity. How do we simplify? How do we distill down to the fundamentals? Let's do that well, because as you know, many organizations, some of these organizations have got the largest budgets out there in the world. You're still going to find many areas where they're not executing on the fundamentals. And it's kind of like building a castle, as I like to say. You've got layer 1, and then you've got level 1 and level 2. Don't want to confuse layers with my OSI model reference again. But you're kind of building towards the castle, right? And what happens if you take a stone out of level 1 or level 2? It's going to impact the upper levels, right? And so from that perspective, without the fundamentals there, it doesn't matter what your security budget is. It doesn't matter if you've got all the most brilliant tools in the world. They have to then just run that little bit harder, work that little bit harder, sweat that little bit harder to be able to make up for those deficiencies. So again, we're going back to that idea of scale and economy, how strategy can kind of deal with that. And it's not an easy proposition to kind of get there and then maintain, because again, if you think about many initiatives, we're going to get it to a point, we're going to call that a win. Okay, no, it's the journey on keeps going. The race is never finished. You must keep going. You must keep pressing. I think a lot of that drift starts to come into play, which is, where you need some kind of continuous monitoring, continuous capability to say, okay, well, that wasn't there a week ago. That could be a problem for us.
And I think one of the challenges professionals, IT, technical, techies have had is they've had this mindset. The mission is to stop all attacks, or the keyword is all attacks, right? Or part of our network got infected, or there were some credentials that were compromised. And sometimes if you don't have the background of risk management, right? Because from a business, they take losses all the time, right? So look at banks who are spending lots of money, right? And it's still fraud, right? But it's baked into the business model, right? They're going to invest a certain amount of money, mitigate a certain amount of risk, and they're okay with that. From our standpoint, I think we came up in the cyber world, in the technology world, with this mindset of stopping everything, right? So it's like if we get hit with an attack, but recover very quickly, and then we look at the business and say, what were the impacts? Maybe no impact at all, potentially. Customers didn't notice. Operation, maybe we had to work a little bit later, late weekend. Business kept running. Or even if the business was disrupted, it could be covered by perhaps insurance, or we accounted for it over a period of time. So let's talk about this perspective of risk management, right? The job isn't to stop every attack, right? It's to disrupt, delay, rapidly respond, rapidly recover. And that's a more sustainable model than stop everything. So let's talk about risk management here for cybersecurity programs.
Yeah, and what I love about let's call it mature risk management capability is the fact that you can understand what is likely to happen to you. Now, again, can you crystal ball everything? No. However, again, the limited resources, where should we prioritize? There's 50 fires somewhere. We can only put the hose on 3, 4, 5 of them. Okay, let's prioritize there. Then shift. So the risk management allows the business to be informed, your security program to be informed. Focus on where you need to focus on the balance of probability. So again, a little bit of a theme of, I would say, being nimble and agile, so you can respond, anticipate. So that's important. And then I would say really very closely aligned with your risk management comments is the idea of defense in depth. So sadly, you don't hear too much about defense in depth other than it being some flashy soundbite these days. Not true for everyone, but true for many. And the ability to kind of say, yes, defense in depth is part of our strategy. We accept that we will not be able to safeguard against every single risk, and things are going to occasionally happen. Just like gold medal Olympic athlete, let's call it Usain Bolt. He's going to catch a cold every now and then. He's going to get a sore hamstring every now and then. Point is, we can manage him to win the race when he needs to, right? And so defense in depth is important. Resiliency is important. Resiliency being we're going to catch a cold or a slight fever every now and then. The main point is we can contain and control, right? And so I think tying that back to, again, strategy, defense in depth, resiliency, very, very important. And not only very important, but I would argue that an organization that has the goal or the mission of never being on the receiving end of a security event is probably not being realistic. And as you will know very, very well, one of the key components of having a mature cybersecurity program is that you are realistic, right, across the board. If you are unrealistic, what tends to happen, you overshoot initiatives and priorities. You don't have clear visibility on exactly what you have in terms of capabilities and maturity. And what does that mean? We circle now back to your risk management argument, right? So all of these things are kind of interconnected. But I think it's important to distill, simplify them in terms of, well, there's all these things. How do they hang together? What can I do about it? What can I do to move the needle today so that realistically tomorrow or next week, I'm a little bit better versus not having tried or not having a strategy and a plan to move that needle.
And it seemed to be one of the critical pieces here is to call it doing this prioritization, understanding how much investment the business has given to us. It's really focused on, once again, talking a little bit about, you talk about likelihood, right? So if a business person turned on the news, it may be totally unrelated for the type of threat actor that might be targeting your particular type of business, right? So we would profile the business, profile the likely type of attacks, type of TTPs against us. So somebody who has presence in a Eastern European country might be completely different to somebody who's just local, regionally inside the U.S., right? It's a completely different profile. So let's talk about analyzing and really being up to speed on what the threats look like out there. So the profiling potential adversaries, their capabilities, and how you're informing, how you're positioning the limited resources you have.
Yeah, and I think the important piece to be aware of here as we think through this is ultimately that the adversary is no longer like just a human. There might be human involvement and coordination, but at the end of the day, there is just this ongoing saga of reconnaissance. So robots scanning, probing, looking for indicators of an obsolete protocol, looking for an indicator of a vulnerability. And as you know, typically when there's a security event, it's leading from something which is apparently benign or semi-benign, and then it escalates, right? So it's a chain of events kind of linking together. And then again, out of sight, out of mind, how do you really know what's kind of happening to you? But I haven't personally done this research from an academic standpoint, but I think you could take your top 50 security events over, let's call it the last 5 years, the events that were on the more impactful side, shall we say. They're going to have key themes, right? So I think it's important to understand what are those key themes that actually led to this. And if you can focus earlier in the kill chain towards that reconnaissance piece, and there's a lot of talk right now around deception strategy. So we have these roles being advertised now, deception strategy expert. This is now becoming a very key point for organizations. And I think what we're starting to see is organizations flip to less defense purely, but more of a forward-leaning capability as well. And I think as we start to think about these threat actors, how can we do certain things that are more forward-looking, more offensive, to be able to take down infrastructure, limit that impact of that infrastructure, distract them, be deceiving. And so I would suggest that over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot more of this forward-leaning capability. I know the US military is definitely looking at this as far as expanding. And then you start to be at a point where you're relying, let's call it less on the FBI or some security agency somewhere to help you. Is forward offensive entirely what's available to you? No, but again, it's just a component that we expect to evolve in response to a lot of the risk and impacts that we're seeing. But as you'll know, and I keep saying this because I respect you and you've got a ton of knowledge, a lot of what gets exploited is frankly misconfiguration, weaknesses, things that didn't necessarily need to be there. And so if you consider what the adversary is looking at, which is a whole set of businesses, let's call it, thousands and millions and so on and so forth all over the world. If you're not grabbing their attention, they're putting it somewhere. Now, I'm not saying it's a good thing that they put their attention to somewhere else and compromise them. But as far as the statistical probability and you need to care about risk management, by taking yourself off the radar, by making it more difficult for anyone to create some kind of impact to your organization, it's a risk reward scenario, right? And they're more likely to not focus on you. So again, starting to go back to that strategic component, tying in some of the technical, tactical concerns to the strategic. All this is obviously very important for a productive and mature security program, security apparatus.
That'll lead to a point I don't think we talk about enough in cybersecurity is the opportunity you have. And have to remember the adversary also has limitations like we do, right? So the adversaries don't have unlimited resources. So I like what you pointed out there about opportunistic, right? So if you more hardened than the person next to you, the company next to you, if your IoT more hardened than your competitor's IoT, the adversaries may completely bypass you and go over there. So it isn't easy that they can just push a button and all of a sudden you're down, right? So we are pretty good. We are forcing the adversaries to adjust, right? So anytime an adversary has to change their TTPs, it means we're doing something, right? We're deploying better technology. Our processes are getting better. There is an actual kill chain. So I think sometimes we have to give ourselves a little bit more credit as an industry that we are forcing the adversaries to adjust, right? Just like having a police presence in your neighborhood or ADT, they may still get into your house, but you are deterring, delaying. You're affecting their operations, which slow it down. And in the world of risk management and business, that's the name of the game, right? Slow things down, avoid the most obvious things. We have, obviously, when things do have, we have insurance in the real world. We have insurance in the cyberspace as well. So I think sometimes we just need to acknowledge that we are forcing the adversary to respond. So then I go into AI just for fun, right? We're forcing them to change on their side of the house. So let's start to get into this whole thing of like this next wave of professionals getting into the business. And like, why are you excited about these new roles that cyber professionals have, and kind of what a professional can think about maybe 5-10 years down the line here in cybersecurity?
Yeah, a space that I'm particularly passionate about, and a very great question. And I think there's a component here of let's call it the standard frame of reference. What should we be coaching, guiding, presenting to folks who say, hey, this sounds like an interesting career, or this is something that would couple with my legal profession, right? Or my accounting profession and give me some kind of differential advantage, or maybe I just care, I like it, right? I think the fundamental thing, and, a lot of people may throw tomatoes at me for this, but it's handy to have a passion for the space. It's handy to have an energy, a baseline of curiosity. I mean, I know I'm quite a curious person, and I've also been the type of person through my career to have done a lot of things. And people would occasionally in my earlier career call me a jack of all trades. And my response will be, well, maybe I'm just passionate about being good at multiple things, right? So, again, started out as a software engineer, then gravitated over to consulting over time. I really liked really difficult technical problems and solving them at scale and making things faster, more powerful, more cohesive, more robust. That was my passion. And then over time, I realized, hey, I'm missing a significant business component to this, right? And that's where I started to wake up a little bit. And now, I'm obviously in my profession, and hopefully a little bit better than I was at the start of my career 23 years ago. But it's important to frame up an energy, a passion for the folks coming through, right? It's also important to have, I believe, a wider perspective on essentially what does the security profession entail? What do we do? I don't think it's correct, just my personal opinion, to say, you know what, you're a security professional, you're going to be the guy that builds kernels for this type of firewall, and that's all you're going to do. And by the way, you don't need to worry about anything else. I don't think that's really the right mentality. Now, you may want to focus there, but it's important to have complementary insights, experiences and skills that make that core skill set kind of better. So that's the first thing I would say. The other piece I would say that, and I guess I'm really passionate about this also, by the way, very important to have passion in this career, right? Yes. So you're going to be doing it for a while and you're going to be, going through some tough times. The understanding of computer science 101. Now, the term computer science or computing, that may scare away a lot of people. But what I see is a lot of security professionals coming through that don't know what RAM is, that don't know what a CPU interrupt is, right? That doesn't know the difference between fast memory versus another type of memory, that doesn't know what cache is. Now, you don't need to know the engineering specs. You don't need to go and build this in a lab. All you need to know is it has a role, and it essentially has a fit within a broader, let's call it, computing architecture. So the technical 101 is very, very important, because at the end of the day, if we're talking about these digital activities or digitally focused activities, it's built on computing architecture, right, for the most part. So I think understanding that, then combining with understanding what about business, understanding how applications work, how they integrate, right, is very fundamental to understanding the types of exploits that can occur in your environment, your applications, your technologies. And as a result, it just makes you, I think, a more of a complete professional. And ironically, I believe that if you're working in more of a strategic risk kind of profession or strategic risk focused profession, the importance of having that technical foundation is even more important, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're working on strategy, if you're working on risk, you need to know the complete north to south, east to west of the profession. You need to be able to talk across really any security domain. You don't necessarily have to have a 10th Dan black belt and everything, but you need to understand concepts, and you need to know concepts really well. It's a little bit like, your software engineering. You don't need to be a Java master to understand that in C there's pointers, right? Or, in Python, this is how it works. Because essentially, I would argue that these languages essentially just expressions of logical concepts, and they're just expressed differently, right? Sure, they have different performance attributes. You can do different things with them. They work differently on different architectures. But it's important to just understand, yes, there are these differences. And what does that mean from a strategic construct perspective?
So, Dan, what you just talked about seemed like it would have been a great thing to package up and send to your younger self. Is this something that you'd have loved to have seen like 30 years ago and have somebody talking in your ear like, Dan, on your path, on your career, these would be some helpful things?
Yeah. So I was very fortunate. I had a mentor who was very, very tough, but also very, very smart. And he was very wise with the things that he would tell me. And I remember that, my first day on the job I was basically first year computer science, got my first role at the end of that first year. And I rocked in and I thought, you know what? I thought I was pretty decent at what I knew. By the end of that day, my heart was shattered because he asked me to build this file server and he gave me a very simple problem and I couldn't figure it out. I was at it for like 5 hours. I was so embarrassed. But I think what I would tell myself is, look, no one knows everything. Again, listen, take a pause. We've all been in that situation where you've got some very difficult problem that you're trying to tackle. And there's this connection or this correlation, and I don't know, I don't want to get metaphysical on anyone here, but I believe that the clarity of mind, clarity of perspective, or quality of those things has a direct impact on your ability and time to solve a particular problem and the manner, the outcome of how that problem is solved. So what I'm trying to say is you could be chewing on a problem like I did for 5 or 6 hours back in that day with the right mindset, being balanced, being thought-focused, asking the right questions. That allows you to be far more productive. And I was the type of person that would run through a brick wall just for the sake of it, because I felt like I always had a point to prove. I felt like if I wasn't doing that, then someone would run through the brick wall more powerfully than I. And over time, I realized, hey, it's okay to get a ladder and climb over. It's okay to go around the brick wall. There's no prizes or heroes awards for any of this stuff. In fact, you will look silly because out of pride or whatever, you'll just latch on and you will just find a way to blast through. So I think what I would tell myself is be patient, try to be wise, ask good questions. If you don't know something, that's okay. Ask someone. Back in those days, we didn't have Google really, right? So that started to come a little bit later.
Yeah.
So I think that's one piece that I would provide to myself. The other thing I would kind of say is, listen, work is not everything. And just because you work 80 hours a week, that doesn't mean you're going to accelerate your career more than if you were to work 40. So be focused, have a good mentor, take care of your friends, family, take care of your work colleagues. People will remember someone who cared for them and who was there for them through the tough times. Because the other side of this, which we haven't kind of mentioned, is everyone's always got something going on at different magnitudes of scale.
Yes.
You could have a family member that's sick. You could be having trouble with a child or a cousin or the next door neighbor. You don't know what people are going through, and people show themselves very differently. So be that person who is there for people. Bring the people quality, the human passion, the human empathy, because people will remember that far more than how quickly you're able to build that firewall kernel or reduce your CPU from 90% to 35%.
That's fantastic. I wish we could bottle this, Dan, and send it back in the past, but we can't. But what we can do is keep getting on platforms like this, giving this experience, this history of how we grew up in the field, and passing on to that next generation. So I'm pretty excited for the next 10 years. And I hope those who are listening, who just getting into this profession, can kind of take Dan's thoughts to heart. And it's like, you have a advantage of him passing this on to you early so you can learn from it. So Dan, we could probably go on for hours here, but I think it's a good place to stop the show. Really enjoyed having you on the show today. So until next time, on the next episode of Smart IT Podcast. In the meantime, if you need more information, you can go to williamreed.info. Once again, thanks, Dan. Until the next time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate being here with you and love the work you're doing. It's great stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for joining another episode of the Smart IT Podcast, where we explore what's next for IT and disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk together. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and leave your comments. And for more Smart IT wisdom, check out my website at williamreed.info.